The Tampa Bay Buccaneers win a playoff game at home against the Philadelphia Eagles 32-9. A lot of projections at the beginning of the year had them going maybe at best 5-12, 6-11. No one had them winning the NFC. Very few had them winning the NFC South, let alone winning a playoff game to even reach that mark. Baker Mayfield has now won a playoff game after bouncing around all of last year. Now, for the record, Josh, I know it was the defense that truly won that game yesterday, but he still threw for 3 touchdowns and had 337 passing yards. The Bucs rightfully should celebrate tonight, or sorry, it was last night now. We are doing this in the morning. But it is what it is. Just to make sure for those who might tune out this very second, the Bucs will play the Detroit Lions next week. It will be on Sunday at 3 p.m. on NBC. What a weekend for the Bucs.
Baker Mayfield to the haters.
Baker Mayfield. Well, the haters aren't going away just yet after a
Well,
playoff win.
hey,
He's won
and
playoff games before, but he did show something tonight.
and for the record, I'm somebody who's never been a huge Baker guy, but I will say this: he did exactly what he needed to do and exactly what he had to do in order for Tampa to not lose that game. He was as good as you could expect him to be. And if you look at some of these runs in the past with teams that have good defenses, quarterback, the goal of the quarterback is just not get in the team's way and hold them back. He certainly didn't do that. He was certainly he played up to the standard. And for the first home playoff game Tampa had this year, and most likely the last, the Bucs were able to win. But like you said, not a lot of people thought the Bucs were going to win the division. Not a lot of people thought that the winner of the NFC South, regardless of who it might have been, was going to win a playoff game this season. The NFC South had been all season considered the bottom of the conference. And now the NFC East is the conference that has no teams left. And the NFC South still has another team, and that being Tampa. One thing I will say from watching last night's game, because I know people are going to talk about it already, because people already are, because we like to overreact in sports and as a society. Number of people are talking about, Baker Mayfield getting a long-term extension, things of that nature. It also should be noted that Tampa has a number of other guys that are possibly free agents this year that I think, with the salary cap, with the limitations that they may face, even if they're shedding some dead money, they need to look at first. I still think Baker Mayfield's a year-to-year type quarterback, because you could very easily go into next year after a run and there could be regression. So it's just one of those things where it's like you keep taking it year to year, in my opinion, on Baker Mayfield. But again, he did well last night. The defense, the front seven is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it's unfair that this defense, which was already a Super Bowl winning defense a couple of years ago, has added Yaya Diaby and Kalijah Kancey, both rookies, and they both appear to be hits, as we've spoken about before. And it's pretty spectacular how far those two rookies have come this season. And I mean, the long term down the road, I mean, you keep this front seven together, they're a special bunch.
No, they really are. And look, Kancey, just for those who might miss the game, had a half sack along with Vita Vea. Yaya Diaby had some very nice tackles in the game. And just one thing that's also that is really spectacular about Diaby specifically is just where he stood among rookies this year, despite the fact that he's a third-round pick. He had 7.5 sacks. He was third among rookies. Is that one of the biggest steals of last year's draft? Is he?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about him being one of the biggest deals, I think it also can come with like what he is coming into, right? So I think part of the reason why he is so successful is, well, one, because all of the other personnel that we already had around him, and with the addition of Kancey in the first round. I think those two guys coming in the same year kind of like fed off each other in a way. So like, I'm not so sure Diaby is doing this on a lot of different defenses where he has to be the guy coming in. Whereas he's a third round dude, and they have Vita Vea, like you mentioned, and Kalijah Cansey, and of course Devin White's still in the linebacking unit. And you got Levante David, who's an experienced veteran, and of course first team All Pro Antoine Winfield on the back end, who's also had a fair share of sacks this season. Where it's like there's so many guys you have to account for, and not to mention they still have Shaq Barrett too. There's so many guys you have to account for that Diaby just has to come in, and he doesn't have to shoulder that big of a burden. He kind of gets to just play his style of football, and he doesn't draw the attention of the superstar players. So I don't know if it's more of he's a superstar player or a big time playmaker as opposed to just like he's just
I
a
didn't
guy.
necessarily say he was a big time superstar or playmaker. I was just saying, based on his rookie season, is he one of the steals of the draft?
He's looking like it. I mean, he's definitely been a valuable contributor up to this point. And I know you mentioned Vita Vea, and we talk about, the Philadelphia Eagles all season long, the tush push, the unstoppable tush push. And they have
The
been
Bucs
stopped
stopped the tush
twice.
push.
Twice in the regular season. Coming into this game, Philly was 18 of 19 on that play. Tampa stopped them once in the regular season, and they do it again in the playoffs. And that was just pretty cool to see because all the media around that being a quote unquote unstoppable play. Nick Sirianni coming out to the media saying, well, they hope they don't ban it because nobody can do it like us and nobody can stop it. Well, they were stopped. And I do think it branching off of that 2-point play that they didn't get it on, I think it's objectively funny that the Philadelphia Eagles ended up forfeiting 4 total points off of Buccaneer penalties.
Look, that's just the one thing about the Eagles, too, just coming into this game. And look, it did end up being the case. They fizzled out in the regular season, and then the Bucs ended up winning by 3 scores. But at the same time, I still didn't expect a performance like this. I didn't. And here's why. A lot of times, teams will struggle in the regular season, and there's only one thing that matters. It's that you get in to the playoffs. Once you're in, you turn it on. The Chiefs showed that against the Dolphins the other night. I'm not saying it's necessarily the exact same scenario. That team's coming off of a Super Bowl win. Well, also, I guess the Eagles are coming off being in the Super Bowl. But you still would think something might change just because they got in. There was a reason they were still favored going into that game. But, maybe it's because of the fact that the Bucs had seen them earlier in the season on the exact same home turf. It just ended up going in their favor. And also, the Eagles' defense, man. Like, I know we were talking about the tush push a moment ago, but where did the tackling go? Because David Moore got his touchdown on the wildest play I've seen in a while, where it looked like he dodged 3 or 4 tackles, was able to cut from the near side to the middle of the field to score a touchdown when he should have been down after the second he caught the ball.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at just the way the Eagles defense performed, and we touched on the tackling, but even just the coverage. I mean, it was so fascinating to see, the broadcast crew go to the replays a number of times last night on plays that Tampa missed, on plays that maybe Baker overthrew or a receiver dropped. I mean, like Tampa's offense, despite Philly's, miscues on defense, kind of in a way got in their own way from time to time, but they were just able to overcome it because of the superb defensive play and the fact that they were still able to make enough plays and the fact that Philly was worse on defense than Tampa was on offense. As far as things go down the stretch, I mean, even Philly dropped an interception yesterday too. When Tampa comes up next week against Detroit, that's a much more buttoned up team. That's a team that you can't make those mistakes. The margin for error is much, much slimmer. So you look at, what's upcoming for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I've obviously looked at the remaining playoff tree, especially in the NFC. The Packers and the 49ers play in the divisional round, and the Buccaneers and the Detroit Lions face off at Ford Field in Detroit next week. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have played like they played Philadelphia this past weekend in the wild card. They have played Detroit, they have played San Francisco and Green Bay all this season. They've played every team already once. So Is that an advantage, disadvantage? I think it helps. I think that doesn't mean that they're gonna, run the table in the NFC and win the whole thing. But what
No,
I think it does, what I think it does mean is that you look at this team and they might get outplayed, but they're not. I doubt they're going to be fooled because they've seen these teams, all of them, before. So they have a general idea of what each team is about. So I highly doubt that Todd Bowles' defense, especially against offenses like San Francisco and Detroit, is going to be fooled by any means because they've seen these guys on full display. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be outplayed because those teams are in the playoffs as well. They've had better regular seasons,
and they
and
are
they've
just
also
better
beaten
teams.
Tampa Bay. They've also both beaten Tampa Bay this year.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was at the Lions game. I can tell you that defense absolutely showed up at Raymond James Stadium, held the Bucs to 6 points. And it's not like the Bucs defense did a bad job either. They kept Detroit, who has a pretty good offense this year, to just 20. It really does just come down to the Bucs offense shows up. And that's what concerns me about next week, is that you look at some of the stats and you're talking about like missed opportunities. A lot of the success for this team came on a lot of players having a single moment. David Moore, he had 2 receptions. One of them was a 44-yard touchdown. Trey Palmer's touchdown was his only reception on the night. He drops that pass. Look, I know the Bucs still win if Palmer doesn't.
Right. I get what you're saying, but I think I can kind of put it up in a nutshell for you. David Moore, Trey Palmer, not two typically key contributors in this offense, but
Exactly.
plays. But they're not like consistent players that you can depend on each week. But in order to make these runs, everyone's got to contribute. But again, you see that from the last game against Philly, and you take it forward. There's no guarantee that those guys are also going to show up again next week. But then again, maybe
No,
Mike Evans and Godwin have big weeks. So it's like it was key to see players like that step up. That's encouraging to see from a Buccaneers fandom perspective. But at the end of the day, it's like those guys aren't routine contributors. So don't be
no.
surprised if you don't see them show up in the next week. So it's like, again, that's why it's a team sport. And that's why everyone's got to find a way to contribute in some way, shape, or form if they want to keep winning these games down the stretch of the season.
Exactly. Like it's nice when you get your 4th or 5th guy making big plays, but if you're gonna beat the good teams like Detroit, and if you're the Bucs, you're hoping you play Green Bay at home and not going out of San Francisco again and taking on Brock Purdy. But at the same time, you're gonna need your star guys to show up. Mike Evans cannot drop 4 passes at all the rest of the way. He can't go 3 for 7 again. Godwin can have a similar night. He had a touchdown, caught 4 of his 5 targets. He's good to go. But
Yeah, and for the record, for Chris Godwin, obviously they threw up the graphic about how Mike Evans has done throughout the course of his tenure with Tampa Bay. Chris Godwin was in second in yards and catches heading into last night, and he's now all by himself, second all time in touchdown receptions with that score last night. So I mean, just a moment for those 2 receivers, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, the careers that they've had in Tampa Bay. 2 of the best receivers that the Buccaneers have ever had, in my opinion, and
they are
hopefully
the best 2 receivers the Buccaneers have ever had.
they both can be in Buccaneer uniforms down the stretch of their careers for as long as possible.
That's the big question. Because is Mike Evans going to be back next year? Or is this it? I mean, you talked about earlier key guys who still have contracts. We didn't really touch up on that after you mentioned it in your intro. Yes, they still got to pay Levante David. They still got to pay Mike Evans. I think Baker is still good for like a 2-year deal. Maybe you'd still draft a quarterback and have him sit behind him for a year or 2 as he develops. I'm not sure how much Kyle Trask will have a shot at this point, which is why I bring that up. Well, I mean, the rookie deals would be very similar, at least when you're talking about the cap. They should be able to find a way just because they are shedding 80 million in cap. Like, think about it. Like, let's say you go out there and you give, and I'm really overshooting it here. Let's say you just go and you give Mike Evans 25 million a year. That's not how he's not making that money. I'm exaggerating on purpose. Let's say you are so crazy about keeping him, you throw him the biggest bag a wide receiver has ever seen. You still have 55 million to work with. Levante David's at an age where If you give him a solid deal, he'll stay. Baker, he can still get a bump in pay, and you still got plenty more cap space to work with than you did last year. Go make upgrades in the receiving core. Go find another safety and a cornerback. I think
Yeah, I
they
mean,
should be
this is
able to
where
figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I'll say I just hope that front office won't overreact to the playoff game that we saw yesterday, because again, Mike Evans is due, Levante David is due. Who knows what the situation is with Devin White? Obviously, he may not be the guy, but again, he's still a guy in this defense that makes plays. And I think a lot of it has to do with expectations. Obviously, if Devin White wants the absurd contract that he's asking for, he's probably going to have to find that elsewhere. But there's just a number of these players that I feel like have higher ceilings that also need to be paid, where it's like, sure, you can, go up to Baker, maybe year to year extend them, maybe a 2-year deal at most. I just don't want to see this front office overreact to a playoff game, pay him the super max, and then he falls off a cliff next year, which would be unsurprising to me. And then, Tampa's defense is a lot thinner because of it, and then they're taking a step back. So it's like, to me, it's a very crucial offseason for Tampa. I feel like they need to make some of the right decisions and have that, wherewithal of looking at the situation as a whole. Because again, this offense really, they missed opportunities last night, even though they made some plays. But against some of these better teams, it'll be interesting to see what they ultimately end up doing. Just because it's going to be fascinating to see. Again, this team was 9-8 coming into the playoffs. They had a win against Philly, but again, Philly was spiraling. So how much does that really factor into that game?
It factors in a lot.
Yeah.
Look, and I'm not disagreeing that the Eagles didn't lose that game as much as the Bucs won that game. And I'm not saying give Baker super money. That is a genuine concern. Does he get too big of a bump in pay to keep him, and they lock him up 3-4 years, and then he goes back to how he played in Carolina? I don't think he would regress that badly. And if you were to give him a bump in pay from 8 million, I say maybe to 12 or 13, I still think that'd be very reasonable after how he played last season. And also just because you'd have the space to give him that, maybe 5 or 6 million extra for 2 years. And structure the deal in a way that if things aren't going well for him, you cut him, you wipe your hands clean, maybe you have a tad bit of dead cap, but you're able to just move on.
Yeah, no, that's what I was saying. Like, it's more of like, yeah, like I completely agree with that. It's really about like how many years and what the dead cap situation is with him. Just again, no, I just no long-term commitments there. I feel like you got to treat it like some of these other defenses in the past that went on to win big time games, like the 2000 Ravens, the 2002 Buccaneers. Just go season to season with quarterbacks, see how it plays out, and if he keeps playing, then maybe sometime down the line, if he continues to play like he's playing, then maybe if there's more cap space available, if there's more money to throw at him, if possible, then sure. But if another team is going to go out there and pay him a lump sum of money, I'm saying just don't like.
Oh yeah, no, just let him go at that point.
Exactly.
Some team wants to pay him 20.
Yeah.
Baker, thank you. They'll go draft Michael Penix Jr., see if Kyle Trask will work out.
And for the record, this is more about what is at stake for Tampa and their roster makeup as a whole, as opposed to what Baker isn't capable of doing. Because obviously, I mean, Baker just won a playoff game for the Buccaneers. How many quarterbacks can say they do?
We're also talking about just the team around him is that crucial. I'm not like, I mean, he did this despite the offensive line. But you're talking about.
By the way, played pretty well last night.
They did. They did. However, that was one of the biggest issues for the last few years. We had guys they had guys retire. Some of their key players who are still technically on the team are hurt.
Jensen's out, yeah.
Yeah. But the ironclad part of that team is the front seven.
It's so good.
And even in the secondary, everyone not named Antoine Winfield, I would still argue, is disposable. I'm sorry, Davis. I'm sorry, Jamal Dean. But if better options come along, you will be upgraded.
No, I completely agree. And I think that was, and again, this is back to the point we were making about contract extensions for the right players, right?
Right.
We had players that walked out the door because they wanted more money that Tampa just couldn't give them. Tampa doesn't have Jordan Whitehead anymore. They don't have Mike Edwards. And by the way, Mike Edwards is now in Kansas City's defense. He had an interception in the last playoff game. He's been sensational for them. And the Kansas City Chiefs defense isn't like Kansas City in the past. They actually have a legitimate defense now, where that's kind of been the strong suit of this Kansas City team throughout the course of their season this year, as players like Mahomes and Kelsey have kind of, taken a step back. The defense has really taken a step forward for them, and Mike Edwards being a big part of that. Whitehead with the Jets had a number of career games over there, and it's obvious that, you don't want to see that continue to happen or bleed into the front seven for Tampa, per se. So it's like, with Devin White and Levante David and those guys, I think those guys, and I think we're on the same page, take priority in terms of
Absolutely.
just handling, the money the best way you can. And I think it's one of those things, though, that is ultimately it's going to make or break what Tampa's offseason is. But speaking of, what Tampa could do going into the offseason in terms of the draft, I think their number one thing they need to look for in this year's draft, because I think in terms of secondary, you can go out and sign free agents, because I think that would do the best for this team, is looking for a tight end. I mean, you look at the Lions, for example. They were able to draft Laporta this year. That could make a big difference in next week's game, them having a tight end. Tampa maybe not having a Sam Laporta at tight end, because one of the biggest drop-offs that we noticed over the last 2 seasons, from one season to the next for Tampa Bay, was when Gronk retired. I mean, Brady in year 3 without him, it was that team just was an absolute disaster offensively. And I think that was a huge hole. And I think that still very much is a huge hole in this Tampa offense. And I think that could also really help this offense out a lot. I think Tampa really needs to make it a priority this offseason to go out there and look for a tight end that can be a valuable contributor.
I definitely get that argument. I would have, if you asked me about the first round, I would have gone offensive tackle, because I still think the O line is that important. But look, tight ends block too.
Yeah, you can
So
never.
in a way, that still helps solve the issue partially. And you're absolutely right. Last year's offense struggled without Gronk. I think this year, Cade Otton taking that step forward certainly helped a bit, but it's just him out there by himself. So going out there and getting a tight end could definitely do a lot. You partner him up. You have just some more talent out there in the receiving options as well. I do actually think that could be a good move. But since you're talking about from the draft, who then is on your radar in college right now?
That was that. At the end of the day, the first thing that we have to analyze is, where Tampa's going to end up drafting from, right? So that obviously makes a big difference. The fact that they're still in the playoffs, that is something that is still going to be unfolding. Obviously, Brock Bowers is not going to be there, because he's going to be a top 5 pick.
Oh no, he's going very early.
But maybe, and I think he'll be there. But Ohio State's tight end, Cade Stover, I've been very impressed with what he's been able to do for the last couple of seasons for the Buckeyes. Especially this year with the quarterback limitations that Ohio State had, he was still able to produce well. He's right now supposed to be like a high-end 3rd round guy, maybe even a 2nd round guy, where it's like, if Tampa's already spent, like you said, 1st round pick on an offensive tackle, why not go for it? You can never have enough of those. 2nd round, corner or another additional safety. If by a chance he's there, it's still in the 3rd round, or even if he's mocked to go higher in the 3rd round, maybe spend your 2nd round pick on Cade Stover, because I think that could be a big time addition to this offense.
I would agree, and you bring a good point with Bowers, just because tight ends, it almost seem like they're starting to go a bit higher in the draft these days than years past. Like, if Kyle Pitts went 4th overall after his time with Florida, I imagine Brock Bowers is absolutely going to be a top 5 pick, maybe even top 3.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the only reason, I mean, talent wise, he's definitely a top 3 player in this draft. He's probably 1 or 2 on the big board in terms of talent. I think it's just going to be hard, just because, with every year with quarterbacks, it just seems like they're so prevalent. Teams will trade up to that number to take a QB, and so because of that, Bowers will probably be around the 5 to 7 range. I feel like maybe 4th. But if he did go 3, I wouldn't be shocked by it.
No, because when you think of who's going 1 and 2, Caleb Williams is 1st overall pick. Drake May's probably going 2nd. And then after that is when you really start to see who it might be. Because, I mean, look, at the top 2 spots are pretty much locked up already. It's really the odds of you going 3 in the top 3 are much lower. I mean, I'm stating the obvious here, but still.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. And like and I think we kind of covered the draft there, pretty interesting. Obviously, I think that you look at, I think as far as tight end, I think Tampa should look at Cade Stover this offseason. Back to the playoff run though, I know there's things are gonna unfold as they will in the next couple of months based on stories and things that happen, but in the combine and all these other things that factor into it. But obviously the upcoming game now, Tampa goes on the road. They play Detroit. Dan Campbell mentioned the home field environment for the Lions in their first playoff game that they've had in what's been seemingly like since the Stafford era, their first playoff win since 1991. And Dan Campbell described the environment like this is something he's never seen before. He said the place was humming. So, I mean, Tampa's got to go in there now. Like that, yeah, they were at home against the Eagles team that was spiraling. Now they got to play a team that that doesn't mess around. That's been a legitimate team, and we've talked about them since our first episode of the NFL season when they beat the Chiefs. We talked about how real this team was, and honestly, they would have been the 2 seed had it hadn't been for the whole illegal substitution, which wasn't debacle by the officials. So, I mean, Harrison, what are you looking for to see Tampa improve in terms of Tampa from this week against Philly to next week against Detroit that you maybe want to see improved on?
Well, if you're going into an environment like Detroit, and look, that crowd, like you mentioned, is going to be loud. They're going into their second playoff game since 1991. They're going to be out there rattling the opposing team as much as they can, trying to create almost like a college football environment. You know what I mean? Because look, ask the Seahawks. 12th man helps. It does. So if you're the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you have to find a way to just go in there, keep your cool. Not even necessarily improvements. You just got to honestly rethink your whole strategy at this point because it's an entirely different team. It's all about keeping your cool and figuring out, okay, if you're on offense, you got to worry about Aiden Hutchinson immediately on the front seven. O-line has to continue to tighten it up. Absolutely. That defense is stellar. If you're the Bucs defense, Amon-Ra St. Brown, man, you might want to double team him every single time because if Goff keeps finding him, they're going to get torched. There's a reason why he was an all-pro.
Yeah, I mean, and the Amon-Ra situation I think does concern me a little bit because if you look at Philly this past week, A.J. Brown was out and Devontae Smith was really the guy that Tampa should have been keying in on, and Devontae Smith was able to get wherever he wanted in Tampa's secondary, was able to make plays. It's seeming like all game long he was just their security blanket. But here is the underlying problem that Tampa's going to have to face with Detroit, to me, that Philly didn't really pose as big of a threat, especially on the offensive side of the ball, and that is, I don't know if they can double team Amon-Ra St. Brown. They could have double teamed Devontae Smith hypothetically because, again, A.J. Brown was out. Dallas Goedert is a minimal contributor at this point in his career. He's not the tight end that he was a couple seasons ago. Detroit's got Sam Laporta that Tampa's going to have to account for. Not saying that they won't be able to account for him, but if they focus a lot of attention on Amon-Ra St. Brown, I still think that's gonna be a bigger problem where Laporta might be a tougher cover if they're putting that much attention over there on Amon-Ra. So, and that's not even to mention Jameson Williams that people often forget about from Detroit. He had a touchdown against the Bucs already this season. He was suspended earlier on in the season, but he's back. He's healthy, and he is also an explosive playmaker for Detroit as well. And I think that those 3 guys, I think it's just going to be tough. I think it's going to really start up front at the line of scrimmage, and Tampa's going to have to get a lot of pressure to force Jared Goff into some mistakes because I think that Amon-Ra is going to get his no matter what type of attention is being placed his way.
That's a very good point. Now, when it comes to the strategy too, one thing the Bucs did successfully against the Eagles was shut down the run. DeAndre Swift did not even get 40 rushing yards. Do you find a way to shut down the passing game for Detroit and try to get them to force to run where they have to run into the front 7? Or do you just hope for the best and go all out and defend the passing game. Send the linebackers backwards. Try to see if you can get extra coverage back there.
Yeah, see, yeah, I think it'll be trickier if you do it that way, just because ultimately with a Ben Johnson offense, like a lot of these other successful offenses that we see in this league, they're just going to take what the defense allows. So if you do something like that, yeah, you may not be giving up the big play per se, but all those underneath plays are going to end up wearing that defense down, because that'll be enough to move the chains and move the chains and move the chains, and that defense is going to be on the field for seemingly hours on end, where they're going to run out of gas. So I think ultimately, the big play thing is definitely a risk, but it's a risk that I think this defense is going to have to take. I think getting home to the quarterback is going to be the number one thing. They have the players to do it. They just have to be able to win that battle at the line of scrimmage ultimately on defense. Whether they play the pass first or the run, they have to be able to get pressure, and I think it starts there. And I think if they're able to do that, they're going to be able to hang into this game, get Goff flustered a little bit, throw them off balance, maybe get them away from what they want to do. But again, it starts there. Again, because the Lions, they also have a good running game too. I mean, David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, they're going to create ways to find a way to run the ball. It's going to start with pressure. It's going to be the best way for Tampa's defense to kind of hold their own against this Detroit Lions offense.
Definitely. And who's one player, and I'll give my answer in a moment, who's someone on the Buccaneers that you feel needs to absolutely show up if they're going to beat the Lions? Regardless of which side of the ball or position they play, who needs to absolutely show up?
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, it's the obvious
We make
answer.
it tougher, not Baker Mayfield, not the quarterback.
It's the obvious answer on both sides of the ball, I think, for me. And it starts with the two leaders on defense, 3-1, on offense, 1-3. Antoine Winfield and Mike Evans, they both have to show up. Mike Evans had a couple of drops. We've seen it from him before, but we know what he's capable of, obviously, with all the production he has had. He's made big plays in the playoffs as well, but we can't get the production that we saw to Mike Evans against the Philadelphia Eagles, against the Detroit Lions, because there's no guarantee, like we mentioned, Palmer and more, having those types of plays again. We got to see more from, and again, Mike Evans is drawing the most attention. He's got the most on his plate. We get that. But guess what? Those big time superstar playmakers that are Hall of Fame receivers, they show up. They show up in the big stage as well. So it's time for a Mike Evans legacy game against the Detroit Lions. Maybe, over 150 yards, 10 catches, 2 touchdowns. Have yourself a big game. Go out there and be that superstar player. And on defense, Antoine Winfield Jr., the first team All-Pro, he's got a lot on his plate too with that secondary that he's having to kind of account for. But again, we can't have plays like the Cooper Kupp play from a couple years ago. We can't have the play like Devontae Smith had this past game, because those could be closer game situations where we can't have those plays happening. And that was, those guys, when they step up, that's the reason why those are the most valuable players to me on both sides of the ball for Tampa Bay. They've been like that all season long. Starts with those two, and if those two show up, Tampa's going to have a good shot at holding their own against Detroit, in my opinion.
Absolutely agree. And my pick was going to be Mike Evans too. I fully expect Antoine Winfield to show up. Regardless of the big plays happen, he's going to still get his job done. Look, Mike Evans is a guy that even if he drops a bunch of passes, he might only catch 3 and still have 110 receiving yards for 2 touchdowns. But also, you can't rely on those plays happening. It needs to be that he gets most of his targets, and maybe at most he misses 1 or 2. I'm not saying he has to get a perfect game. That's a little unrealistic for almost anybody who has higher than 4 or 5 targets in a game. But it has to be, he needs quantity. Maximize every single potential play he can get. Yes, the legacy game needs to happen, but it has to happen on more than 2 or 3 targets, because you're not going to get a lot of the big plays they saw against teams like the Titans, where, it's just, you're playing a legitimate team here. You have to show up every moment you are on the field. If Mike Evans does not do that, it's over. And you could also go to Godwin, obviously. And you know what? I'll go a step further and say Cade Otton needs to have a big game, because he's the only tight end out there who's able to get his job done. He goes out there, 4 catches for 60 yards, get the Bucs into the red zone, you're good to go.
Yeah, and I think obviously, all the points I think you said were valid, especially in terms of Mike Evans. And we've seen him do it. We saw him do it in the NFC Championship game against Green Bay and Lambeau, making those big plays. And he can be the difference maker for sure. But ultimately, it's gonna be a great matchup. I think coming up this Sunday, for sure against or Saturday, depending on when they schedule it. But obviously, the Bucs winning a playoff game this season may be something that a lot of people didn't have on their bingo card. And I mean, this defense, it's so stellar to watch, and it's going to be fun to see how far this team can go. We've seen a Tampa team make runs before with a defense. It'd be interesting to see how far this defense can go.
Absolutely agree. All right, just for those who need to know as we wrap it up here, the Bucs go to Detroit to play the Lions. It's currently scheduled for Sunday at 3 p.m. Obviously, that could flex, but as of the recording of this video, that is what it is for now. And we'll be back next week after that game to talk. Hey, games early enough in the day where we could definitely do an immediate reaction. So stay tuned for that. I'm Harrison. This is Josh. This is the Awkward Sports Media Podcast, and we will see you next time.